and welcome everybody to this month's Indy Jigsaw Show. And this month we're going to be talking about radical tax reform. And when we say radical, we do mean radical.
We really do mean radical. And we're going to be telling you about that by talking to Graeme McCormick.
Graeme has written a book all about his ideas for how you could revolutionise the way that we get money into Scotland and what we then do with it. And he's created a little 6-minute video to show you the basics of his idea. So the first thing we're going to do is play that. You might wonder, who is this Kate that he keeps referring to? Kate, it was Kate Forbes, who, when he did this presentation, Kate was part of that meeting. So Kate doesn't actually appear in the video at all, but that's who he means when he's talking to Kate, just in case anybody was confused about that.
Yeah, great. And I'll tell you, prepare to be amazed. You may have some questions about the arithmetic afterwards, and we're going to go into that with a bit more with Graeme.
So Graeme's slides are taken from his book, Annual Ground Floor and Roof Rent. And here he's going to tell us exactly what that means.
Welcome to AGFR, Annual Ground Floor and Roof Rent, funding towards a wellbeing society. Why land? It's constant, it can't be hidden. Policymakers divide it into 4 land types: rough grazing, forest and woodland, arable and urban. Because most properties are over 1 storey, we double the size of urban land types. So for AGFR, Scotland's space, which includes land and all floor and roof areas, is 84,820,000,000 square metres. Here are the areas and shares which each land type contributes to the national total. Urban is defined as all non-agricultural buildings and all buildings and land serviced by the public sewerage system. According to GERS, the total spending in or allocated to Scotland by all forms of government in the UK is £81,015 million. But AGFR allows us to substantially increase this by adding 10% of current Scottish Government spending plus £55 billion to provide an annual universal citizens' income of £10,000 for every Scottish resident. That gives a total spend of £138,440,700,000. The suggested rates per land type are for rough grazing, 0.0166 per square metres, for woodland and arable, £0.051 per square metres, and for urban, £10.01 per square metre. You will note that on the right-hand column, over 98% of the funding comes from the urban land types. Here's how the owners of a typical suburban house calculate the liability for AGFR. Make their returns online and pay the AGFR to Revenue Scotland. Here we show how AGFR will be calculated for space which is not standalone. There are reliefs for agricultural buildings, how to calculate common property and tenements and common amenity areas. Owners of urban land type properties can recover the AGFR from their tenants, and rural landowners can recover half the AGFR from their tenants. To give you a flavour of the AGFR charged on some typical spaces, we've highlighted a modern semi, a small flat, a single fronted shop, a large arable farm, a small tenanted upland farm, and what Scotland's largest landowner would pay. As AGFR will replace all taxation, here is the estimated annual taxation a person on current average earnings currently pays and what he or she will save if they live in an average type of property under AGFR. A staggering £6,896. And that's before each occupant receives a UCI of £10,000. You must be wondering where all this extra money is coming from when people will save so much from their current tax liability. It's quite simple but also remarkable. There is just so much space throughout our country which is not contributing anything to public funds through dereliction and a failure to maintain vast areas of public and private space. Some are individually very small, but taken together they form a massive untapped public funding source. So here's how AGFR can let Kate transform life in Scotland. Kate can end poverty with a universal citizen's income of £200 per week. Kate can end the concentration of land in the hands of very few, so everyone who wants to own a share can do so without subsidising the price from the public purse. With a UCI, Kate can ensure that those starting or developing a business have the comfort of knowing they have UCI to fall back on if their business takes time, or even if it doesn't take off at all. And AGFR provides the flexibility to change and increase land types, cap, relieve or exempt the owners of certain types of spaces due to restricted incomes or other reasons. Make Scotland the first truly property owning democracy, where 10% of everyone's UCI is invested in Scottish business. Deliver the land to solve the housing crisis, as the obligation to pay AGFR will force space owners who don't pay it to release land to be developed by the social and private housing sector. We even encourage councils to raise most of their funds from their own AGFR land types and rates, so that support from the Scottish Government and national land types charges could be reduced accordingly. This would enhance the status and independence of local government. And even if technology reduces traditional work opportunities, it can ensure people have fulfilling lives through the UCI and investment in Scottish innovation and development. As you can see here, we feature the principal benefits. They are not just for an independent Scotland, but as AGFR can be introduced under devolution, puts money in the pockets of all of us now, including those still to be persuaded to vote yes. It provides the hard evidence that pensions and other public services will be even better under independence. To conclude this précis in AGFR, from this table you will see that while AGFR offers tremendous improvements in people's take-home income with devolution, they are substantially better with independence. It raises take-home pay income to levels enjoyed by our Norwegian and Swiss friends. In the forthcoming independence referendum, she who controls all Scotland's public funds will control the debate. AGFR provides this control. If you would like a more detailed explanation of AGFR, why not buy a copy of my book? It's £10 including post through PayPal, or email me on t1feu@hotmail.com.
So that was Graeme's very brief, but 6-minute intro to his ideas. So I don't know if you haven't come across Graeme talking about this before. First time I heard him talking about it, I really was amazed, and to be honest, I was a bit disbelieving. I just thought, oh, couldn't it be that good? I mean, partly you think, if it's that good, why haven't we already done it? However, actually, it is such a radical approach to taxation and raising the money that the country needs, and doing it in such a radically different way. Now, I have to say, I also checked out the arithmetic. I worked it out for the house that I live in, which is kind of an average kind of sized house in Scotland, 2 people living in it. And to begin with, I thought, oh, goodness, that's a bit of a hike. I'd be paying a lot more for this setup than I am at the moment for council tax. However, when you add in then the benefits of this radical approach, you just realise it more than evens out. I mean, certainly in my case, which I think is quite average, we were benefiting hugely from it. So we're going to be talking to Graeme next. Have a listen, see what you think. What I really appreciate was his emphasis now on the way in which this kind of much more radical approach will really help bring people out of poverty, help people's lives, help people's well-being, help people's quality of life just through upping their income. And he didn't really talk so much like that a couple of years back when I first heard him talking about this. And maybe it's something that's come out of, you know, what he's been thinking out during the pandemic and all the rest of it. But here's the interview, and I hope you appreciate it. I'm now here with Graeme, and Graeme, thanks very much for agreeing to come into our studio, although of course it's all online and you're sitting at home, and so am I. I've sat in a couple of the talks that you've given around the country on the subject, so there's always a few things that questions that come up on that, and they tend to be the same sort of areas, so maybe we could go over that. But it's a wee while since since you did all those talks. Well, and the calculations certainly show that there's an awful lot of wealth in Scotland that's untapped, as it were, by the current taxing system, and you kind of lay out a completely different way of doing it, which is pretty amazing. So we're just wondering, has your thinking moved on at all since you came up with this and got the book out? And I mean, I think you sent a copy of your book to every MSP. Did you get much response from them? Have you got any more recent ideas about the whole system?
Thanks for having me, Marlene. Well, in fact, my wife and I delivered a copy to every SNP MSP at Holyrood. The response is that I haven't heard from any of them to date. I often find too that when I have done the presentation and there's a parliamentarian present, they are incredibly quiet. So that's a wee hurdle, I think, that one has to get over. But we'll plug on. The other thing, of course, is we're in such a state of hardship that is going to be visited on so many people, and we have people that basically they don't live, they exist, and they've existed for a long time, and they don't ever seem to be able to extricate themselves from poverty. But on top of that, we're now actually going to have an awful lot of people who have probably never really experienced hardship. And although I take my hat off to the Scottish Government for all the kind of mitigation which it's introduced, that is clearly not enough. And instead of mitigation, we've actually got to look at transformation. So my belief is that there has never been a better time to introduce my model of annual ground rent, because virtually all the infrastructure is in place. It needs the legislation, but we are in an emergency, and in emergencies, governments have got to, and parliaments have got to act very quickly. And we did it to some extent with COVID, and you do it when there are emergencies like wars and things of that nature. Well, this is going to be some emergency for people. So I really do implore the Scottish Government to think really quickly about how they can raise sufficient money so that we can prevent and lift people out of poverty. And it's not right to say that we're constrained by the Scotland Act and the reserved powers not to do this, because we can do it. And I've already said it's under Section 80I of the Scotland Act. We have the power to bring in something such as my model of annual ground rent, and we can do that without recourse to the UK or permission from the UK government or HMRC. And that would be a far better way of doing it rather than the alternative, which is basically for the Scottish Government to raise income tax and earned income, the rates on that. Now, that would be hugely unpopular, and that would basically just, increase people's tax liability. This is a way of actually looking at the land and property, which we don't receive any public funding from at all. And it's such a huge area of our country that's involved in this. And so it is a new source of income, and it is a source that will generate so much money that we can lift people out of poverty, and we can give everyone, a universal citizens' income of, I've shown the illustration of £200 for every adult and child every week. Now, okay, the child payment is an advance on not having it at all, But, you know, £25 a week or £30 a week or £40 a week is nothing in comparison to £200 a week. So I think this is the moment to be bold and do it.
Yeah.
And we can do it without recourse to Westminster. And, you know, I reckon, you know, that if you got all arms of government involved in it, they could have this in place within 6 months.
Wow. It's just an interesting context to, you know, to hear you putting it into that, and, you know, thinking about well, we're not out of the COVID pandemic, but, you know, at least life's back to a bit more like, you know, like normal. But during the worst of them, you know, the lockdown and everything, there was a lot of talk, wasn't there, about, and I mean very genuinely, about building back better. Politicians were using it. I mean, not only in Scotland, I mean, UK wide, but you don't hear very much about that particular kind of way of looking at things now. It's kind of, I suppose, you know, it's easier to slip back into thinking, well, okay, well, we're back to a bit more like normal. Let's take it forward from here. And obviously, there's a lot to take forward. I mean, you know, now we're hoping that we will have a referendum by the end of next year. But I think that whole Build Back Better and your ideas about, you know, the annual ground rent, well, it's a really good example of one way in which we could do that in Scotland. And I mean, I don't think I'd quite picked up that actually, you know, so much of, because you must need a lot of infrastructure there to be able to do it. I don't think I'd quite taken on board that a lot of it's there already. Presumably, what is that like? Tax revenue system and the land register and...
The problem with the existing tax system in the UK is it's very, very complicated. It's incredibly complicated. And so we wouldn't want to adopt that. And in fact, an independence would be daft to adopt it because it would use up so many resources, and the negotiations involved with the UK government, as you know, what bit's apportioned to Scotland of somebody's tax and what's apportioned to UK, etc. You know, that is legacy stuff we want to put one side. In the present context, we have a land register. It's not complete, but we don't need to worry about that. We have the General Register of Seizings, which is the oldest compulsory national register of deeds relating to land anywhere in the world, formed in 1617 when we were supposed to be poor and stupid and all the rest of it. We have Revenue Scotland, which is the Scottish Government's own tax collecting agency. We have the land register also has what's called a cadastral plan, which your viewers might not know what that is, but basically it's this massive digital plan where as properties are registered in the land register, it fills in a bit of the plan. So basically, it can tell what areas are registered for land registration and which have still to be registered.
Okay.
So we have these things. We also have the internet, and we have a government. The way that my system would work, it's so simple, is it's not for government to register people. It's for owners of land and property to actually go on and register for what I call AGFR, which is my version of the annual ground rent. So the responsibility is on the owner of land and property, regardless of where they are in the world and who they are. They have to register for that, and they register for that, and then they also, so that's registered through what we might call a register of AGFR or something like that, but that is linked so that, as it happens just now, it's linked to Revenue Scotland's website, and they in turn are linked to the Land Register website. Basically, what would happen is, as people register for AGFR, the cadastral plan would colour in the bit that they've registered. So government would know, you know, what areas have been registered and what have not, which owners have registered and which have not. So it's basically, what would be required is that the Revenue Scotland's website, for example, would need to be, the capacity would need to be increased. And probably rather than just have one massive website, what you would have is possibly 32 websites. They would be all linked together, but they would reflect the local authorities.
Yeah, right.
People could register that way. That's just increasing capacity to do that. That's a technical thing to do. So that's all there. And basically, because the onus is not on government to register people, but on the owners themselves to register, that means that, you know, after a certain time, might be 2 years, 3 years, for example, if somebody has not registered and paid their AGFR, then the legislation would indicate that government has the power to repossess these sites because they're not registered.
Yeah.
Just example, if you're a mortgage lender, you can do that. Or in fact, there are other things such as notices of potential liability and all these kind of things that already go on the land register. So it's similar to this. And in order to secure payment, basically the start of every financial year, the land register would register against every title an AGFIR notice. And that notice would remain on there until the AGFIR was paid. So it means that somebody couldn't sell their property or mortgage their property, until they actually paid the AGFIR. That would also be the document which would give, it's like a charge. It would give the power to Revenue Scotland to repossess in the event of it not being paid over a certain period. And that's the way it works. You can't avoid
it. They can't avoid it. Maybe we'll come back to that in a wee bit. But I just wanted to pick up again because I was quite taken with you when we started talking here about, you were talking about, let's see if we can find a way to help people out of poverty, if that's where they are. And yeah, there's certainly big increases in energy charges coming down the line. I mean, pretty soon they're going to be happening. I think the current kind of estimate is something like, instead of average energy cost for a household being about 800, 1,000 quid, it would be over 3 times that amount, over 3,000 possibly. So I was quite taken with you putting the AGFIR into that context. And one of the things that came across as thinking about what we might talk about today was something called the Pennsylvania experiment. I think I'm sure you've heard about it. I think I sent you the link, but that was in Penn State, when they've got a land valuation tax system. Now it's not exactly the same as what you're proposing, but I noticed that when the various parts of Penn State are talking about what effect it's had, that actually what the equivalent of local authority leaders are saying, that it reduced the tax paid by people on lower incomes, it reduced tax being paid by older people. I just thought that was interesting because, listening to some of the question and answer sessions that, you've done around Scotland, it's clear that some people do get concerned when they hear about your ideas, because it seems like a big hike in the money to pay out compared to what they're probably paying at the moment for, their current council tax. So on the one hand, it looks like, at least the way they run it in Pennsylvania, that isn't what happens. But at the same time, people do get a bit worried about it. Examples came from folk who were maybe retired, or there were maybe older folk living in bigger houses, maybe not paying any income tax, or maybe just with smaller incomes. So I guess if this was going to be kind of taken further, it'd be important to definitely be able to allay those concerns for people, wouldn't it?
Yes, that's right. If we deal with the American one in Harrisburg, I think is the capital of Pennsylvania, I had a look at that, and it's actually a bit different from mine. They basically charge tax on land 4 times the amount that they charge on buildings. So basically this was a means by which they were forcing investors in vacant land to do something with it. And that's a good thing. And it seems to have had a tremendous beneficial effect there. And of course, the American tax system, again, you've got local taxes, you'll have state taxes, and you'll have federal taxes too. So they're all working from different levels of government. To be quite frank with you, I don't know enough about the American tax system to see whether what I was proposing could apply across the board there. I don't know. What I don't think that they did was that they don't tax vacant and dilapidated buildings 4 times. Right. I think it's just land. Now, we've got a problem with dilapidated buildings and half-empty buildings and all the rest of it. And the Land Commission indicated that 60%, probably over 60%, of dilapidated and vacant land in urban Scotland is owned by the public sector. Yeah. Now, I don't know America, but I suspect maybe that the public sector, the local authorities, don't own such a high percentage of land and property as possibly we do, and I think that's possibly a historical thing. I don't know, but I suspect that's the case. But we've got to tackle this, because that is a huge resource which is going to waste. People are living in areas where land and property have been left unattended or just ignored. And that means that there's land there already that could be building houses. It could be improving environments. It could be improving everyone's sort of well-being. So we have that issue. And of course, under my proposal, land in the public sector is also liable to pay it. So it actually pushes not just those people that own vacant land, but also dilapidated properties to do something with it. And if they don't do something with it, then basically they've got to get rid of it, whether they can sell it or whether they've got to give it away or lease it or whatever, but so something is done so there's a return. Otherwise, it's draining funds from them. So land and properties have got to be looked at as a responsibility and liability, as well as a right and an asset.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at older people, there's obviously going to be some people that are either living in huge houses and there's only one person or a couple, or they're going to have a massive garden, really big garden. Because I live near Helensburgh and there's some quite big houses in Helensburgh.
Quite big houses, yeah.
and quite big gardens too, albeit quite a few have been split over the years. I calculated that under my model, if you also include universal basic income of the kind of amount I was suggesting, then probably less than 1% of the population will actually be out of pocket. And if it is somebody, for example, who's in a big house and they have got really quite a modest income, then we could cap that. But one of the things, it's not just about raising more money, it's also about, stewardship of what you own. And I know, I had a mother who, my dad died quite young, and my mother was left in quite a big bungalow with a big garden. So I'm not in the business of chasing people out of their houses. We can put some sort of mitigation in place for that. I would think, bringing a system like that in, within, say, 10 to 15 years, the culture of ownership in Scotland would change, and people would be conditioned to know, well, look, is it really sensible for us to have the big responsibility, not just of paying an AGFR on a property that's got a lot of ground, or it's a big house when there's very few of us actually living in it, but also having to maintain it? Because you could have a far better and more comfortable lifestyle, particularly as I suppose you're getting older, if you're conditioned to think, well, yeah, there is a time to move on. That's also one of the reasons why I think it's actually quite a good thing to do. One of the early shows I did, it was a magnificent house in Dunoon, and it was just my luck, the owner of it was in the audience. And I had a photograph of it and I'd calculated much. And he came on and he started saying, he says, my income's such and such. He says, I wouldn't be able to afford this. And it was a huge house. And he was quite a young man. I said, how many folk, do you share this house with? He says, I'm in it on my own. And it had a huge garden and whatnot. I said, well, have you thought of splitting it up, or maybe a bit of ground or whatever? What are your plans for it? He says, I just bought it. I said, do you know I struggle to try and maintain this house? And he says, yeah, he says, I do. So, funnily enough, I think after about 3 months he'd sold it. So he'd taken my advice. Anyway.
Trying to kind of change how people think about and introduce something new. There's always folk around, genuinely enough, who get worried about, well, would I be able to afford it? And I read your book it was probably more than a year back now, and I tried to do a wee calculation for where I live in this house with my husband, and it's not a big house, but it's kind of normal, kind of semi-detached West End of Glasgow. And, I kind of got a rough idea about how much I pay. And I did gulp a bit and go, well, what? And then I carried on reading to find out yes, but what would then happen? And then, of course, then you add in, well, we're not paying any council tax, and we wouldn't be paying. I mean, if we went the whole way down the line of what you're suggesting, there'd be a whole load of other kind of outgoings that we wouldn't pay. Plus, your system would give us 2 loads of, a citizen's basic income. So by the time you added that in, I was completely converted actually at that. It's fair enough, isn't it? People have these concerns, but maybe it's also just important to stress that at the other end of the spectrum, not someone who's got a big house somewhere or a big garden, or maybe they do need to downsize a bit, but at the other end of the spectrum of Scots population, that actually there could be a what sounds like a very, very, very kind of significant uptick in in people's income.
Yeah, I mean, I think in my book, what does show a 3-bedroom semi, which I've taken as a kind of average house. A 3-bedroom semi-detached villa with average urban garden. The AGFA, if we were independent and we brought this in and we got rid really of all the other taxes, it would be about £4,400 a year. I'd worked it out under Devolution 2, and that reduces to £3,262. So we'd still be liable to pay the UK taxes, such as any capital gains tax, inheritance tax, if that was applicable. You'd have your tax on unearned income, so any kind of money that you've got invested. You'd still be paying insurance premium tax, national insurance if you're paying national insurance, VAT, etc. These kind of things. So under independence, there's significant saving. In fact, there's significant savings even under devolution, because I think I'd worked that one out. That somebody in average earnings, their take-home pay basically after tax, etc., just now is about £15,200. That's the kind of figure on an average salary of 26,500. With devolution, if you brought in AGFA, and AGFA would then remove your council tax, it would remove your income tax on earned income, because the Scottish Government could put that zero rate that. Your take-home pay would rise from 15,200 to over 26,000. So it's a significant saving.
Yeah.
But if we go the full boona, so to speak, and go for independence, then your take-home income would rise to 31,500. Now that might sound fantastic, absolutely fantastic or fantastical. But actually, when you take into account the take-home pay of people in Norway or the people in Switzerland, it's not that far off what they're taking. Yeah. So it's possible.
It's possible. Yeah,
and that's even possible. Before we actually look how this will develop our economy, because land will become available, dilapidated buildings will become available, people will take these on, develop them, etc. And the actual impetus to the economy will be massive everywhere. And so it will generate even more finance to the economy and, encourage people to get involved in doing things and expanding our economy.
What about things like, businesses where, they haven't really got any, land footprint, as it were, successfully running a business, but which is mostly done online, and maybe they keep their computer in their spare room at home. They could be making a reasonable income from that, which is great. They're not renting premises. They don't have any land footprint. You can't tax the cloud where they do their business. Any ideas how you could bring that in?
I think, first of all, you've probably got to some extent make the jump between why we tax income as opposed to why we don't tax elements of wealth. Let's put it this way. If my system can raise enough money, more than enough money, to lift people out of poverty and not have income tax and all these other things, why do we bother too much about what people actually raise in income? Because basically, if we have a system in Scotland where we have just one tax system that raises more than enough money, then what are people that are earning a lot of money going to do with their money?
Yeah, right.
Now, if they invest it abroad or they buy things abroad, they're going to have to pay the taxes that are charged abroad for that. The vast bulk of what they have, they will reinvest in Scotland. Yeah. They'll invest in things in Scotland, and that will have a hugely beneficial effect, in our general economy. And it will mean that instead of us being so desperate to get inward investment from foreign banks and all the rest of it, it will be Scottish money that will be invested. It will be homegrown money that's going to be invested in our economy. So I'm fairly relaxed about the idea of having people who are super rich. Because the other thing we've got to remember is that with what we call globalization and robotics and all the technological advances, is that more and more of what we do is actually going to be done by robots. That's just going to happen. I mean, commentators are already saying that over 60% of the jobs we do today within 10 to 20 years won't be there. Now, there might be other jobs, but that doesn't mean to say, we'll be working as long as we are just now, we'll be able to work as long. So the responsibility in government to make sure that we don't just exist, but we can live fulfilling lives, will mean that we're going to have something, universal citizens' income, so that people can actually live. The people that are going to be extremely wealthy are the people that actually basically own the models, own the copyrights, own the patents, and all the rest of it like that. And it's the licensing. They're going to make their money out of license things. And that's why it's so important that Scotland as a country, which has a very, very good record, excellent record of research and development over the centuries, actually invests in that. And our government should be throwing money at research and development so that all the wonderful ideas that come out of people's heads, whether they're from universities or not, is actually invested in, so that increases our economy, and it increases the share that we all can get from it, so that government can actually contribute by way of a universal citizens' income, so that we, as I say, we all have that benefit. We can do other things. It might not just be employment in the traditional way, but a lot of people do things voluntarily, accepting.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the way I think we're going. So we've got to bear that in mind. What's going to be happening 10, 20 years down the line, so that we can ensure that everyone has a fulfilling life.
Such an interesting take on it. Why do we always think in terms of taxing wealth, and if we've already got a system that can can produce the kind of income that your calculations would indicate is possible?
Mm-hmm.
And again, the point of after all, if we've got a lot of money and we spend it in the local economy, fine, that helps everyone as well. And presumably, possibly there's other sort of glitches, like someone's maybe running their own business and they've got a certain size property, and next door to them there's an equivalent property, but it's a charity shop. But presumably that kind of thing can just be allowed for, right? The government could allow for helping someone who's running a charity shop not having to pay.
Yeah, I mean, I base this on four land types. There's urban, there's agricultural, there's rough grazing, and there's woodland. You could reduce that to two. You could have urban and rural. But you could also, have umpteen variations of that. You could have commercial. You could have, as you say, charitable ones, so that they would have a lower rate per square metre that they would be charged. They might not be charged anything at all. That would be for government and policymakers to decide. You could introduce new ones. For example, people have said, what about behavioural taxes?
Yes.
In my book, I've kind of left them and said, we'll leave the tax and whiskey and that kind of stuff. But in actual fact, the other way to do that would be to say, right, we will have a land type and a rate for premises that are licensed. So if they've got a liquor license, or they're a distillery or something like that, then they would pay at a higher rate per square metre, rather than have it as a behavioural tax. This would be a kind of backdoor behavioural taxes, in order for the proprietors of these establishments to pay their AGFR. They would obviously have to charge a higher rate for their products.
Yeah.
That would be one way of doing it. You could do it. So that's the way you deal with behaviour stuff, I think. In addition, I mean, we've had all this concern about the huge amount of money that the energy companies have been making. Well, there's no reason, for example, why we couldn't have one or even more land type relating to the structures that energy companies own. So you've got pylons, you've got things out in the North Sea, you've got all different sort of things that they have. So you could actually put a charge on things which are part of the energy industry, and that would be a way government could increase the revenue and make the difference between one sort of owner and another, or one sort of use and another. Because again, I mean, a lot of the stuff that local authorities, for example, own are. You might think, well, they should be free of AGFR, and there might well be a case for some of these things. But the other side of the coin is that the problem that we've had in the past with local authorities and other public corporations in this country is that they have amassed so much by way of land and property that they just haven't maintained it or used it.
Yeah.
And they're under no pressure just now actually to use it and do it. So you will find that, for example, there could be 180 hectares in Easterhouse that have been sitting there since the 1980s, since they demolished some of the buildings, and they've just been sitting there, but there's been no pressure to do anything with it. You wouldn't want to just say, right, if it's owned by a local authority, they don't pay anything. You would need to be very sort of careful about that.
Yeah, and that would also catch, the other kind of thing that happens where there's private investors who own land often in the city centres, and they just let it go to rack and ruin.
Yeah.
Because they're waiting for either they're just waiting for a chance to develop it as something else, and it's not maybe economically the time to do it, or they're waiting, they're kind of staring down the local authority to give them permission to do something like that. I mean, there's a few examples I could thinking of in Glasgow for that just now. So all of those then are seem to be advantages, and I mean that certainly what you said certainly covers the kind of some of the questions that that you've been asked were about that. What about, does it not cut back on the government's flexibility to try and nudge behaviours, something like that. So that's certainly answered that point. You touched on this earlier. What if someone just doesn't pay?
If they don't register for it or they don't pay, then basically they lose it. It's a charge on their property. So they can't ignore it. So if you're a trust or somebody away in Grand Cayman or goodness knows where else, then you don't get away with it. You lose it if you don't pay it. So the powers of Revenue Scotland would be legislated for, whereby they could repossess in the event of a payment being outstanding for a certain period or a failure to register within a certain period. I had initially suggested 3 years. I think that's probably too long. So that can be done. So it's equivalent to the potential powers that a mortgage lender has for non-payment, that they can call up their security or charge, or whatever you want to call it.
So we don't need to actually be able to find out exactly who owns it because it's in the registered as a company somewhere or an investment fund. Okay, so then it's repossessed. At that point, Scottish Government would own it. Would they also be then responsible for, I mean, say there's houses on it where people live and they've got jobs. Scottish Government have to step in and keep that running, or can they sell it on?
Well, it would depend on the circumstances. Let's say it's just an estate that's not got anyone living on it as such. Okay. Then in that particular case, the Scottish Government could choose to repossess it, and they could sell it on, or they could lease it or sell bits of it, or whatever, these kind of things. There would basically be a mechanism whereby they could calculate all their costs and all the AGFR which hadn't been paid, and deduct that from, say, the sale price that they get, and then whatever balance they would return to the defaulting owner, if that defaulting owner actually presented themselves and identified themselves. Otherwise, that money would just be kept in deposit somewhere until such times as they appeared. But the issue of, say, for example, somebody owning land, and there are a number of people maybe renting houses on it and all the rest of it. Well, I mean, that happens just now with securities over large areas where the actual owner defaults, but is maybe let properties out to people. There are means by which their positions can be secured. All that would happen there, in fact, would be that the Scottish Government would come along to the tenants and say, well, look, your landlord or whoever has not been paying the AGFR. In terms of my model anyway, the landlord can seek to recover the cost of the AGFR from his tenant. So why he's not done that, goodness knows. And so basically the Scottish Government would just say, would you now please pay what you're due? That's the way that would be covered. Because it's important to remember that by circumstance and also by choice, some people do not own the property, for example, they live in. Yeah. If we were going to have a model where it was only the owners of property and land were to pay this, then that would basically mean that, tenants wouldn't actually be contributing anything to the public purse. And I don't think that's a particularly good idea. So that's why an owner of an urban property would be entitled to recover the cost of their AGFR from their tenant. Yeah. And of course, the tenant wouldn't be paying income tax and wouldn't be paying all the other taxes that they have to pay. They wouldn't be paying council tax. So it would be fair to tenants.
Yeah.
What I've suggested in the rural situation is like a tenant farmer, that the actual agricultural element of the property that they rent, they would only pay half the AGFR, so that the landlord would only be able to recover half the AGFR. And that's basically, again, to sort of make life easier for tenant farmers and those who actually work the land on there. But so there's different sort of permutations that can be had. The other thing to remember too is that, you know, although the actual total contribution of a non-urban property to the total tax take, if we call it, or public finances, is very modest. It's only about 1.5% of the total. It's still a significant amount of money for a landowner to pay that they're not paying just now. The position there, you know, would be that they would need to pay it. And you might well find, and I'm sure you will find, that they will say, well, look, most of this land we have, we cannot make that sort of return in order to cover the cost of the AGFR. So we will go to the Scottish Government and ask them, will you take some of that off our hands? Now, it'd be up to the Scottish Government to decide whether they want to do that or not. Yeah. But you could imagine the situation where the Scottish Government says, right, we have the ability to actually acquire a massive part of Scotland from Gretna up to Shetland, and probably a lot of points in between, whereby that is land which could actually be rewilded. Which of course is you know what we're seeking to do, but we've got this crazy system just now where we're actually giving large landowners the ability to get grants to rewild large parts of Scotland, to restore peatlands and things like that. And I really think that grates. You know, I don't think we should be compensating people like that and organisations like that for something which they should be doing anyway, you know, as part of their responsibilities as owners. So again, you know, there's a real opportunity here to change the whole tapestry of what Scotland looks like. Yeah. And I think it's going forward with climate change, etc. You know, this is the time to do something like this. I mean, I've spoken to a couple of big landowners and representatives of them, and you know, after I've sort of showed them the initial proposal, and they managed to get up off their feet, and they say, gosh, actually, there is something in this. That okay, we own vast areas of land that we really do nothing with, and we don't have to do anything with, and we just basically sit on it in the expectation that one day maybe the government will come along and say, well, we want to build a new road or something like that, and you know, we make a bit of money out of that. But basically the maintenance and the ownership of that land is not something which is basically ideal towards their economic model. That there are other things that could be done, so that if they actually significantly reduced the amount of land which they own, which they basically consider as unproductive, then that might be a better model for them to use as well.
Yeah. Oh, it's just fascinating, kind of you know, getting a bit more, get reminded a bit more about all the possibilities that are part of that, and it would be just brilliant actually if Scotland could put some of that into effect going forward. I mean, like you said at the beginning, some of it could be done even, you know, before we're independent, but you know, even more so afterwards. So if you had a free hand, what could be done right now then to start up a move? And, you know, have you got any plans yourself going forward to help more people about this?
I've got a few wee videos that we're working on just now, which will wee snippets. I've got a few more presentations lined up around the country. I had a resolution based on it approved by my local branch of the SNP last night, which I think is going forward to be suggested for the agenda for our national conference. Remains to be seen whether it's accepted or not. But I mean, I'll keep plugging away at it. But I actually think that just the emergency which is emerging before us is probably that there will come a time where people who are probably grateful for what the Scottish Government have done to mitigate their anxieties and their costs, you know, that will change, and people say, well, look, it's just not enough. You've really got to do something now. We can't wait for independence. It's probably going to be 3 or 4 years down the line. We've got to do it now. This is a way of doing it. and, you know, just focus on that. And so I think that the emergency that confronts us is probably the best bet for it being done. People have got to think differently. They've got to think about out the box. And this is an ideal way to do that. And the thing is, as I say, it's relatively simple to get going. It's not perfect. Nothing is ever perfect, but it can be reviewed and it can be built upon, and it can be changed and varied, as inevitably these things always are. But, you know, if it's putting money in people's pockets, then that is the most important thing of all. That really is. If I can just finish with this, my wife's involved in the Trades House of Glasgow, which is probably one of the biggest charitably giving institutions in the city, and one of the crafts was holding a meeting, and there was an official from Glasgow City Council there, and he came up with a statistic that I found absolutely staggering. 40% of children in Glasgow cannot afford to have trainers to take part in gym. Now, I just thought that's a small thing, but no, it's a massive thing.
Mm.
You know, so if we're in that state, you know, what are people going to do? They need money in their pockets, and this is a way of doing it, and doing it in a way that encourages enterprise and makes people's life better. So just get ahead and do it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for coming in, and let's all keep our fingers crossed that you know, minds over in Holyrood and elsewhere, and local authorities open up and take this on board, because it certainly sounds like, whatever version, you know, might appear, it certainly sounds like it's got a great deal of potential to help people. Yeah, thanks again.
My pleasure.
I talked a lot before Graeme's to go over that interview with Graeme, Fiona. What did you think about it?
Oh, well, first of all, the whole concept just sounds too good to be true. When you first hear it, the idea that we wouldn't have to pay any kind of tax, no council tax, no VAT, no income tax, and we get a universal basic income. So I think I kind of approached it from the perspective of this can't possibly be true. But then as he works through the mathematics of it, but even more than that, the sort of morality of it, that's where I thought, this is hugely innovative thinking. And what I thought was a real shame was that right at the beginning, he told us he had sent a copy of his book to every single MSP, and not one of them's responded. Isn't that a shame? Even to open their minds to the possibility that if not a whole big bang approach, is this something that could be tried small scale, or, you know, within even the confines of devolution? Are there things we could do? Since speaking to Graeme, I actually noticed that Alaska has a UBI, a universal basic income. And the article I was reading, it seems to work. What they said it has done is slightly shifted the way politics works, and how big part of the discussion is how much is my UBI, and that sort of drives a lot of policy making behind it. But that aside, it's clearly able to do it in containable areas, and there have been some pilots around. Finland
ran it for a couple of years. I mean, if anyone's interested in finding more about the basic income side of things, just Google basic income. There's a lot of groups working on it. There's a lot of information there. And actually, I think at some point we should do an edition just on the basic income.
We should, and I know Commonweal have done a lot on that, so that could be something we come back to. But in terms of Graeme's idea, it just, to have somebody just imagine this whole, conjure up this whole concept out of his head, then work his way through proving how it could work, I think is astonishing. And the idea that we wouldn't consider it at all just seems like such a wasted opportunity. So there's a challenge for the Scottish Government. What do you think of Graeme's work? You've all had the book. What did you think of it? Come and tell us, and we'll happily give you screen time if you'd like to explain it to us.
Yes, exactly. And, you know, once we are independent, we can be radical. We can be radical in ways at which it's not possible. at the moment. And wow, isn't that an exciting thing to, to have on the horizon if we just can get enough of us to vote yes?
Do you know, there was one particular point during it, and I thought this is switching the balance of our society and playing better to our values. And it was when we'd asked him that question about, well, what if you've got a company that's cloud-based and you can't get money from them? And in the end, he said, well, does it matter? As long as we've got enough coming in, what does it matter that people have more disposable income? Because they're going to spend it here anyway. Yeah. And I thought, yes, this obsession with getting money from everybody, you only need the money you need to create a well-being economy and a well-being society. And once you've got that, why are we bothering about raking in the last penny from people? Let them enjoy it, let them spend it locally, let them go on holidays, do good things with it.
Exactly.
I hope that's given everybody some food for thought. And get the book, Annual Ground Floor and Roof Rent, and it's only a tenner, which I think includes postage. We'll put the email address on the screen. The Scottish Government is currently carrying out a consultation on land reform. If you'd like to contribute to that, you can find it on consult.gov.scot. There is also a very interesting section called We Asked, You Said, We Did. And it's the result of previous consultations and also tells you those which are live. So if you want to get more involved in government, give your opinions, that's the site to be on. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you all again next month.
Yep. Bye.
The Indy Jigsaw Show is brought to you by the Indy Life podcast team. We also bring you Scottish Independence podcasts with a new podcast every Friday, and sometimes some midweek extras as well. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can also check out our website, which is podcasts.independencelive.net. Also follow us on Twitter @ScottishIndiePod, or email us indylifepodcasters@gmail.com. Thanks for watching. Bye now.